Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. This week, we'll cover Southeast Asian tariff negotiations with the US and Singapore's general election.
We'll also cover 75 years of Thai-Cambodia diplomatic relations and developments to the Indonesia-Russia bilateral relationship. Today's Thursday, May 1st. This week, Greg is joined by Erin Murphy to discuss updates in Myanmar following the earthquake. Before that, let's start with our headlines.
Welcome back, Japhet. We were both away for the last episode of Southeast Asia Radio, so it's nice to be reunited again.
Thank you. Welcome back to you too. I'm a changed person now with a new love for British food.
We just finished eating a British-inspired steak pie that Japhet made for lunch, and it was delicious. 10 out of 10, no notes.
Thank you.
But anyways, let's get into the podcast. So first up, we'll start with something that everyone seems to be talking about these days, which are the tariff negotiations with the US.
Right. This topic is crucial, especially as Southeast Asian countries are key players in the global trade network. Let's break it down and see who's making progress and who is stalled.
Let's start with Vietnam. So Vietnam was hit hard with 46% tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump, which is one of the highest tariffs faced by any US trading partner. In response, Vietnam and the US have officially kicked off bilateral trade negotiations, with Vietnam's Minister of Industry and Trade, Nguyen Hong Dien, and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer initiating talks over the phone. They aim to address the trade imbalance and negotiate mutually beneficial solutions.
Okay. Now let's talk about Thailand, where U.S.-Thai trade talks have hit a bit of a roadblock. The negotiations, which were initially set to take place on April 23rd, have been postponed, and it seems criminal investigations against some Americans in Thailand are one of the key reasons behind the delay.
That's right. Former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra mentioned that the U.S. has raised concerns about certain criminal probes involving Americans, including the royal defamation charge against Paul Chambers, an American academic and advisor of Naresuan University. This case, along with others, seems to have led the U.S. to delay the talks.
Despite the postponement, Thailand is still focused on preparing for future talks. Thaksin noted that Thailand needs to calm down and focus on gathering the right information to present in upcoming discussions.
Moving over to Malaysia, which faced an initial 24% tariff rate, the government has expressed a willingness to negotiate with the United States on several key issues, including reducing the trade deficit and addressing non-tariff barriers. This comes after a visit by Trade Minister Tengku Zafrul Aziz to Washington last week.
Yeah, right. So Malaysia is looking to open discussions on a bilateral trade agreement with the United States to ensure mutually beneficial trade flows. Malaysia is also working on ways to address U.S. concerns, all while avoiding retaliatory measures.
Meanwhile, in Cambodia, the government has made a significant move in response to President Trump's threatened tariffs, and to ease rising trade tensions, Prime Minister Hun Manet offered to slash import taxes on a range of U.S. goods, but experts warn this gesture may not be enough to satisfy the Trump administration.
Yeah. Initially, the Trump administration had announced a 49% tariff on Cambodian imports. Trump's 90-day universal temporary reprieve gave Cambodia the opportunity to propose a drastic reduction in tariffs on 19 American product categories, cutting them from 35% to 5%.
Hun Manet also made it clear that the tariff cuts were a peace offering to improve trade relations with the United States. How effective this strategy will be is yet to be determined.
In a move to address the U.S. tariffs, Indonesia has also made moves, pledging to increase its imports of energy products from the U.S., including liquefied petroleum gas, crude oil, and gasoline.
Indonesia's chief economic minister, Erlangga Hartarto, made this announcement after a series of high-level talks with key U.S. officials, including Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick, Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. In the discussions, Indonesia also agreed to continue importing agricultural products such as wheat, soybeans, and soybean milk.
Wow. So it sounds like Southeast Asian countries are really prioritizing addressing this with the United States. While other Southeast Asian nations are also negotiating, we've simplified the news here to cover the countries in Southeast Asia which were impacted the greatest by U.S. tariffs. We will continue to bring you the news on this topic as it develops.
A country that we have not discussed yet, Singapore, recently dissolved its parliament and will have elections on May 3rd after just 9 days of campaigning. This election will be the first major test for Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, who assumed office last year following the long tenure of Lee Hsien Loong, the nation's leader for 2 decades.
This election campaign has focused on key issues such as the rising cost of living, housing needs, jobs, and the growing demand for healthcare as Singapore's population ages. As always, voters will likely weigh in on the performance of the People's Action Party, which has dominated Singapore's political scene since the country was granted self-rule in 1959.
In the 2020 general election, the PAP secured 83 out of the 93 seats, but the opposition Workers' Party made significant gains, securing 10 seats, the highest number of opposition seats since Singapore gained independence. This time, 97 seats are up for grabs, and the ruling PAP is looking for a stronger win, aiming to solidify its hold on power.
The Workers' Party remains the main challenger, with a YouGov poll suggesting that around 63% of voters would support the PAP, while 15% favor the Workers' Party. However, the race is expected to be closer than previous elections, especially given the concerns surrounding the cost of living and the government's response to those issues.
Coming into the final days before the election, all eyes will be on how the candidates address these concerns and whether Singaporeans are ready for a shift in leadership or will continue to favor the stability of the ruling PAP.
Hopping over to Cambodia now, where Thai Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra met with Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet last week to mark the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the two countries. While there, Paetongtarn also met with Cambodian Senate President Hun Sen, who is a known ally of her father and former Thai Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra.
Just last month, former Prime Minister Thaksin was making headlines for his alleged interference in Thai politics through his daughter. These allegations led to a censure motion being tabled against her by the Thai opposition, who argued that Paetongtarn lacked the maturity and political know-how to hold office.
Paetongtarn defeated the censure motion, but criticisms over her father's influence on her political decisions loom large. Nevertheless, her trip to Cambodia was a productive one. She and Hun Manet announced increased police cooperation on combating online scams, including declaring that the Thai and Cambodian governments would not allow scam groups to operate in either country.
And they also announced enhanced military cooperation on the border, coordinated efforts on demining, and improved land transportation links connecting the two countries. Thailand and Cambodia signed 7 memorandums of understanding covering cooperation on the Cambodia Friendship Bridge, cross-border environmental initiatives, skill development, and infrastructure.
That sounds like a wonderful celebration of the two countries' long-standing relationship. But when Paetongtarn returned to Thailand, she was hospitalized with a high fever, and her weekend engagements were cancelled. After 2 nights in the hospital, Paetongtarn was discharged and is expected to continue her engagements as normal this week.
Wishing her a speedy recovery. Another important bilateral relationship making headlines in the region is that between Indonesia and Russia.
That's right. Recently, a defense industry report claimed that Russia requested a permanent airbase for its warplanes in Indonesia's Papua region, located just north of Australia. Since then, Russia has defended its military ties with Jakarta, but has not outright denied the claims that it sought access to the base.
This development caused quite a diplomatic upset in the region. Australia was immediately worried by the reports, with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese stating that Australia does not want to see Russian influence in its neighborhood.
The Australian government immediately reached out to its Indonesian counterparts to get to the bottom of these reports. Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister Richard Marles met with his counterpart Safari Samsudin to seek clarification on the nature of Indonesia's relationship with Russia. After the meeting, Marles told Australian media that Samsudin denied that Russia is seeking to establish a base in Indonesia.
More recently, Indonesia's President Prabowo Subianto and Russia's first Deputy Prime Minister, Denis Manturov, met in Jakarta to discuss a free trade agreement with Eurasian countries.
While the deal wasn't finalized, Prabowo is headed to St. Petersburg in June this year, and both parties are hopeful that an agreement can be reached through that diplomatic meeting.
Perhaps they'll discuss more than just free trade in this upcoming meeting, especially with rumors circulating about Russian access to Papua's airbase. And those are the headlines. Did we miss anything that you wanted to hear about? If so, please write us at scaradio@csis.org or DM us on your favorite social media platform. Up next, Greg's conversation with Erin Murphy. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to another Southeast Asia Radio. Folks, as always, I'm Greg Poling with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Last episode, I told everybody that co-host Alina Noor of the Carnegie Endowment would be back, and for that, I was a liar. Alina's still not here this week, and I'm very sorry. I hope to stick around anyway, because we do have a better guest than just me this week. We're joined by my colleague, Erin Murphy. Erin is Senior Fellow and the Deputy Director of our Chair for India and Emerging Economies in Asia. But that's not why she's here. More importantly, Erin is a longtime Burma or Myanmar watcher, author of Burmese Haze, and is here to talk about the goings-on in Myanmar. So, Erin, thanks for coming back after, I think, about 2 years absence from the pod.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to fill in such big shoes, but always happy to come back and talk about Myanmar, or maybe happy is not the right word. Just misery loves company, I guess.
So why don't we start with the last thing that I saw of yours on Myanmar? You wrote a commentary for CSIS shortly after the devastating earthquake that struck Myanmar at the end of March. So last count I saw was nearly 4,000 been tragically killed in Myanmar and more than 200,000 displaced, which has just been, tragedy, as you said, piled on top of tragedy given the devastation already caused by the civil war over the last 4 years. So what was the big takeaway for you from the commentary?
Yeah, I think, looking at the numbers, those are likely low in terms of how many died. I don't think we'll ever really know. And this is partly because a lot of these numbers are, the official ones. And, this is not a government that really keeps great track of its people. It has a pretty poor record when it comes to that. But, I think the key takeaway is that, for a country that's already suffering quite a lot, not only from a coup, but also the impact of COVID, ongoing conflict between the ethnic armed groups and the Tatmadaw. And then you have this earthquake on top of it. It's just misery piled onto misery. So you already at this time had 3.5 million internally displaced. So this just adds to that number of people who are insecure, both in terms of housing, safety, but also food insecure. And at a time where the U.S. is pulling back on aid and assistance overseas and probably would have been one of the first in the door to help.
The U.S. lack of response has been particularly heartbreaking and damning, I think, for the United States. I don't know if you have heard any updates on what the U.S. is actually delivering or providing. The last I was tracking, obviously the U.S. aid teams that were in charge of doing work on the Thai-Burma border had been disbanded like everybody else when the administration started dismantling USAID. And then after the earthquake, the administration suddenly scrambled, realized what a bad look this was, and said, oh, never mind, we're going to send a few $1 million out of the Embassy Bangkok. And Embassy Bangkok said, there's nobody here to deliver it. And it just kind of got shoved into the ether while other states, including China, stepped up to provide assistance.
Yeah, we really looked bad in this whole situation. And, this was, I think, the administration's first big test in its USAID dismantlement of a major international crisis. And not only did they eventually send a 3-person team, when they arrived, they were told that they had been doged and fired. And so they weren't even able to do any of the work that you would expect a relief or recovery team to go in and do. At last count, it looks like the United States has provided $9 million, which is a bit of a paltry sum in the grand scheme of things. It was announced that $2 million and a 3-person team would be sent out. And then about a couple of weeks later, they said we're going to add another 7 million. And this is being funneled through UN organizations and international aid organizations that are there, but also through local organizations that the U.S. Embassy in the country has connections with that are trusted to be able to really get the money to people who need it. Certainly a dollar goes far in Myanmar, but when you think of how much else other countries have been providing, not only in terms of teams and search dogs and supplies, it's really just kind of a pathetic amount.
Do you have a sense of how that aid is getting delivered and through what authorities? The worst hit area would be Mandalay, the second biggest city in the country, and Mandalay is still under junta control. So I presume that most of the assistance, particularly from those who have fewer scruples than the U.S. about engaging with the junta, are just doing it directly through the government. But parts of Shan State in particular were also badly hit. Are we getting funding to ethnic resistance organizations and the National Unity Government who actually administer some of these other places that were damaged?
That's unclear. My guess is that it's not going to those types of organizations. Certainly with the Burma Act, the U.S. can provide non-lethal assistance to anti-government groups. And certainly this would be one great example of how to deliver aid and assistance to people who need it. But, the U.S. started making connections to local NGOs in the aftermath of Cyclone Nargis in 2008, which was yet another devastating natural disaster that hit Myanmar, killed about 138,000 people, and completely wiped out the Delta and the southern region. And local NGOs really proved themselves to be capable of delivering aid somewhat under the radar because the junta was keeping an eye on them. And they were acting in an apolitical way, putting, the needs of the country over any pro-democracy efforts. So it is likely that some of those organizations that likely have connections in these areas are able to deliver that aid and assistance. But the U.S. is also working through international organizations, through the UN, that will hopefully be able to deliver and not work necessarily through the junta itself. I think that there's always concerns that in providing money or any assistance is going to go to the military first and, trickle out to the population.
Cyclone Nargis, another good example of the point you made that you can't trust the numbers coming out of the junta because 100 and nearly 50,000 as the official count has always been believed to be quite low. And I remember a WikiLeaks cable from the U.S. mission in Yangon quoting a senior junta official saying that number had just been fabricated. It was an obvious low count. So what has been the impact, as far as we can tell, on the course of the civil war? First, the National Unity Government, and then the junta finally was shamed into declaring a 20-day ceasefire. And I think the junta just a couple weeks ago at meetings in Bangkok agreed to extend that ceasefire. But that doesn't seem to actually be stopping artillery and bombs dropping on resistance organizations.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's like the earthquake hasn't really slowed anything down. Within hours of, the first tremblings, which again was a 7.7 earthquake, which is pretty crazy and big. I mean, when you have buildings collapsing in Bangkok for an earthquake that was originating in Myanmar, that says a lot. But within hours, the junta was already targeting and shelling groups in Shan State. And to the point where, in one of Pope Francis's last speeches while he was still alive, called out the conflict in Myanmar. And certainly, Min Aung Hlaing may have thought he got into everyone's good graces by putting out a call for international aid, which is yet another thing that the junta is not known for. They usually block aid. That was the case in 2008 Cyclone Nargis, but also in the cyclones that have happened in the last couple of years. So he probably thought he was doing something great, would have been seen as like this magnanimous leader, like, please come in, international community. But you can't do that and then just go ahead and start bombing ethnic armed groups. But he's declared a ceasefire on April 2nd. And after his meeting with Anwar, and Anwar from Malaysia was there in his capacity as the ASEAN chair, decided to extend the ceasefire to April 30th. So we've got about a day and a half left. But in that time, there's been various reports, but there was an unpublished UN report said that there has been about 207 attacks, 140 air attacks. And out of those total attacks, 172 of those was after the earthquake. So this earthquake ain't slowing anyone down. And when you look at the seasonal calendar, part of this might be, well, we have rainy season underway, so we're not going to be able to undertake some of these offensives. So might as well get them in while we can. But it's pretty egregious to agree to a ceasefire and continue to shell. These ceasefires around the world don't seem to be worth the paper they're written on. And that's certainly the case in Myanmar.
We'll circle back to the resistance organizations in a minute. But since you brought up Anwar's meeting, let's talk about how Min Aung Hlaing and the junta have, from my perspective at least, seemed to kind of instrumentalize this to launder their reputations. Min Aung Hlaing has made several visits to Russia since the coup, and he visited China, and that was it. And then twice in the last month, he's gone to Bangkok. First for the BIMSTEC summit, which had nothing to do with earthquake recovery. He was just invited because the Thais and Indians and others seemed to think it was time to bring him in from the cold. And he got to meet with Modi, and he got to meet with Prime Minister Paetongtarn. And then in the middle of April, he goes to Bangkok again and has this special meeting with Anwar. And I will take Anwar at his word that, he thought that this was a unique opportunity to bring the sides together and try to push for the extension of the ceasefire. But Min Aung Hlaing has not traditionally been good to his word. And so I worry that this is not the last time he's going to get feted at an international organization. This door has now been cracked and it's not going to be closed again. Yeah,
I have fears about that as well. I don't disparage Anwar for trying to find an opening. Myanmar has been a hot potato for ASEAN since the coup. And, I think that every ASEAN chair has been completely befuddled by the complete intransigence of the junta that, they're not doing anything. And if you can anger Hun Sen for not doing anything, then you're really not doing anything well. But I think there was a fear, not just in the pro-democracy community, the NUG, the EAOs, that this could be a step towards Min Aung Hlaing rehabilitating his tattered reputation. But, I'm sure ASEAN is pretty sick of Myanmar being the disaster, the black sheep of the family that doesn't allow them to have a more unified front. Myanmar's not invited to fora. They're not invited to the East Asia Summit. They can send a civilian, but Min Aung Hlaing is not there. But, you have a couple of opportunities that I think Min Aung Hlaing is looking to that will bring Myanmar fully back into the cold and allow at least a tacit acceptance from not just Russia and China, which, good friends I suppose to have when you're on the outs, but not the only friends that you want to have. They have an election supposedly coming up. And I think that, this is a way for Min Aung Hlaing to say, look, I accepted international aid. Isn't that much better than before? And we have this election coming up and I'm pretty committed to it, although it's been delayed several times. So, and the fact that he met with Anwar, and it looks like he also met with Thaksin as well. And Thaksin is, of course, raising his hand to bring peace to Myanmar. But, I think this is not a guy to be trusted. He has proven himself to be who he is time and time again. This ceasefire ridiculousness after the earthquake, I think, is just, a great example of, once again, the intransigence. He's speaking out of both sides of his mouth on it.
Yeah. It's not just that a brutal junta is being potentially rehabilitated, because that alone would be bad enough, but that would imply that the junta at least governs the country, and therefore, out of some sense of realpolitik, parties are choosing to engage with it. But that's not the case. The junta controls a third, maybe 40% on their best day of the country. And so this is, at least in the case of, say, the BIMSTEC summit, the Thai government and other members of BIMSTEC officially invited the junta to represent the entire country of Myanmar, even though the junta does not administer anywhere close to the whole country of Myanmar.
Right.
And Anwar can claim that he was also meeting with representatives of the National Unity Government, and Malaysia has been a strong proponent of engagement with other actors, including EROs. But coming so soon after the BIMSTEC summit, what it looks like is that Anwar, as ASEAN chair, was meeting with Min Aung Hlaing as head of state of a country that Min Aung Hlaing doesn't actually control. And that looks an awful lot like ASEAN picking a side in a civil war.
Yeah, even if that was not the intention. But I mean, if you're Min Aung Hlaing, that's great press. That's something that you can completely spin and say, look, they recognize us as, the stewards of this country. We're going to bring in the election and, we're the ones really running the country. But your point is certainly clear that they don't represent most of the country. I mean, even during Cyclone Nargis, where there were still pockets of resistance and ethnic armed groups of various sizes, and certainly the breakdown of some of the ceasefire agreements, you had a better understanding of who you were talking to and who controlled most of the country. You had troops everywhere posted, whether it was light infantry divisions or in larger contingents. You just don't have that now. And the ethnic armed groups have certainly taken and control a lot more territory than they ever did before. So, yeah, you can talk to the NUG, you can talk to the junta, but they certainly don't represent the whole country for sure.
So let's circle back then to the actors on the ground. The NUG, which doesn't actually have armies, has declared a ceasefire. Do we have a sense of how much the actual fighters, mostly the People's Defense Forces and the EROs, have stopped fighting? We've already talked about the fact that the junta hasn't, so they have to defend themselves.
Right. I mean, that's a good question. It's, I think for the most part, when you look at or read the articles of journalists and others that have been embedded in some of these areas, but also reports from NGOs that are working in these communities, there were people who were trying to go back home and then were immediately shelled. So it seems that at least on the ethnic armed group and PDF side, there was an observation of, ceasing hostilities. But yeah, you go right back to self-defense, and then it becomes kind of a vicious cycle of who shot first. But I mean, it's kind of clear at this point, within hours of an earthquake, I'm sure no one was thinking, well, let's just go after the junta. It's more, we got to find our people and, get them out of unstable buildings and whatnot. So I think this only lights the fire among folks that the junta cannot be trusted. And, I think that extension of that sentiment will go to folks that try to negotiate with the junta.
While the recovery is still going on, we also had this Chinese brokered handover, at least temporarily, handover of Lasho, the city in the Kokang region that was taken by the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army last year, despite China's demands that they stop the fighting and let the junta have the city. So after months of negotiation, basically with a gun to their heads because China had kidnapped the head of the MNDAA when he went to China for medical care, they finally forced the Kokang to give up the city and sent what in any other context we would call Chinese peacekeepers, which is unprecedented, to oversee this. Do you think that these two are related or just a coincidence that the Kokang finally cracked under Chinese pressure after the earthquake?
I think that it had been going on for so long, and China has been watching what's happening in the Kokang region for years. When the ceasefire initially broke down in 2009, the subsequent violence that occurred spilled right over into their territory. It included IDPs, refugees that were generally temporary. They would flee the violence and then go back into Myanmar. And, since then, it's been a very uneasy peace. And then, of course, when you had the resumption of conflict that only increased after the coup, China's been keeping an eye on it. If there's anything China loves, it's stability and a quiet border, which Myanmar has definitely not been providing. So, I think the timing is a bit coincidental, but I think that, it's just maybe it offered an opportunity. But I think for China, it's just like, let's just get this deal done and start moving. But I think that this has been part of a longer plan. The earthquake could have derailed it or pushed it forward. But I think regardless, I think that this has been something that China's been pushing for a very long time.
I worry that this series of events, the seeming laundering of Min Aung Hlaing's reputation by fellow, neighbors within Southeast Asia, the turnover of Lasho, the stabilizing of the Karen Border Guard Force's control, the Karen National Army's control in Myawaddy after the Thai-sanctioned crackdown on scam centers, that's going to feed this narrative that we hear from time to time in Washington and elsewhere that this has become a stalemate and the junta is inevitably going to stabilize the situation, hold its election, so we have to just hold our noses and engage. And that's the narrative that China would certainly want to push, and that's the narrative that Bangkok seems to believe, and yet you have, the Arakan army has consolidated control of everything in Arakan state except for the city of Sitwe, and it's marching across Irrawaddy region for the first time, spilling outside of its desired homeland. Ongoing offensives in Kachin and other parts of Shan and Karen. The junta's failed in efforts to retake any large cities in Chin state. So I don't see any evidence that the junta has gotten anything except for a Chinese brokered turnover of a single city that they can't actually hold. But I'm not sure that that's the way that those who would encourage engagement with the junta are going to spin this.
I agree. And I share the same worry because if you look at the headlines from the last couple of weeks, despite the earthquake and thousands that are dead, it looks pretty good for Min Aung Hlaing. And to be fair, actually not to be fair, but I think people are just tired of what's happening in Myanmar for ASEAN, for China, not so much on the India-Bangladesh side, but I'm sure Bangladesh would also like to get to a settlement in terms of returning the Rohingya and getting that out of the way. So I think in some senses, there's almost an impatience of just getting Myanmar to get, almost back to a status quo that maybe was 15 years ago or whatnot, but to just stop. But even if there is a tacit acceptance of, Min Aung Hlaing and the junta sort of being the sole arbiter of negotiations and getting to an election, it really just is, it doesn't tell the full picture. As you point out, they have hardly any control in Rakhine State. The same is true for throughout the periphery. And there's still going to be active resistance, even in the central Myanmar, in Mandalay and Yangon, for people who just will not accept the junta. And this election, I can't imagine is going to be very peaceful either. There's already been statements, or at least, whether official or not, that anybody who runs, not necessarily on the junta ticket, is going to be a target for assassination because no one's going to support this. So it's a stalemate is one way to look at it, or just, an ongoing violent engagement in the periphery. So even if there's like a semi-civilian government that comes into play next year, they're still going to have a mess on their hands. And, the military is still going to be deeply involved because it requires keeping the country together, preserving its sovereignty, and, quelling any sort of uprising. So it's still going to be messy with like this veil of democracy.
Yeah, I tend to think that a lot of folks on the outside had their perception of how civil wars work twisted by too many Hollywood blockbusters.
Yeah.
Right? Like coups launched in 2021, outpouring of support for the resistance, and then there's not some glorious march on Mandalay and Yangon within a year, and people start to say, okay, well, obviously now it's a strategic stalemate and the junta's going to get back control. That's not the way that civil wars work.
No, they grind on and on. I mean, even with Ukraine, like you see the impatience there too. It's like, oh, let's just get a ceasefire. And then you have Trump over the weekend be like, Vladimir, stop, because he's violating the ceasefire as well. And it's like, yeah, these things are super messy and they grind on and on. And it's tough to keep up, the support. But if you look at the resilience, the fact that they're still pretty active, even after all of these years, it's pretty incredible.
I imagine that the same people arguing for engagement with men on by necessity now probably also would have said a year ago that Bashar al-Assad's regime was ironclad, was bulletproof in Syria, and anybody who thought otherwise was being naive and Pollyannish.
Yeah, and then those that, believe in signs from the universe would also say that this earthquake is telling Min Aung Hlaing it's time for him to go. But yeah, it's true. Things can turn on a dime, but you still have a mess to clean up after.
Yeah. Well, Erin, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to have to leave it there. And this time, I am going to not confidently predict that Alina will, in fact, be back for our next episode. But thanks all of you for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks for the next episode of Southeast Asia Radio.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at searadio@csis.org, and we'll be sure to answer your questions.
Do us a favor and subscribe, and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever streaming platform that you listen to us on. Tell your friends about us.
Marla Hiller is our producer, and our interns are Sophia Datta and Gemma King. Our host today was Greg Poling. My name is Japhet Kitson.
And I'm Lauren Mai.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.